So anyway, obviously the topic of the day is the Capitol Hill riot and all of that sort of thing.
Oh,
There's quite a bit to unpack within that topic. Everything from crazy right-wing responses to almost equally crazy stuff coming from the far left.
Okay, yeah, let's start with that. What is it from the far left that you're seeing? I don't think I have seen any very noticeable.
Well, I mean, basically, I responded to it in the Against Unreason group the other day, that comment thread that we were talking in, that probably within hours of finding out that the crowd had breached Capitol Hill and gotten into the Congress building, but before hardly any actual concrete data had come out, a lot of the people on the far left were already trying to turn this into yet another example of white privilege, yet another example of how whites get treated with the kid gloves, and how, basically trying to make an apples to oranges comparison with the National Guard that were in DC to supposedly protect from the riots of the summer. And in the time since the actual Capitol Hill, riot, we've learned that, in fact, a lot of similar stuff did happen to the crazy MAGA people that also had happened to rioters or protesters during the summer, in that a crazy MAGA white lady was shot and killed. There were people getting gassed. There was stuff like that happening.
Okay, yes. It's not that absolutely nobody was shot, but their point was that they were able to get so far in, they got shot. Whereas when you look at the National Guard, that wasn't the Capitol building. Actually, that was Lincoln Memorial. Different situation. I'll give you that. Different situation. But the National Guard was clear. Nobody breached this, and they didn't have to. They didn't have to say we're gonna shoot you, because if you come close to us, everybody knew that. That's the difference between people who aren't afraid to push against cops, force themselves in, and people that see a gun and say, back off. We hate it, but we'll back off.
Right. So a couple of differences that I would point out between I'm referring to a meme that was going around on January 6th, where it was that picture of the National Guards people at the Lincoln Memorial or whatever. And so when those National Guardsmen were called in to DC to, supposedly defend against rioters and whatnot, that was after multiple riots had already been going on. And I can't remember the exact timeline, but it may have been a week or multiple weeks.
Okay, yeah, that's fair. Yeah,
they saw this stuff coming. Whereas the only hint that you would have had that this was coming, as far as the Capitol Hill riot now, was a select group of insane people on the right-wing alternative to Twitter Parley. And so there wasn't a whole series of riots, and they couldn't have predicted with equal certainty or likelihood that was going to happen.
Okay, that's a fair point. Now, you may still be wrong insofar as there's more information coming out that the intelligence community had some warning that there might have been people planning to attack the Capitol, but that's a whole different story.
It's entirely possible.
Let's take for the premise that you're right. There were no series of riots leading up to this. It's partially true, at least in terms of, in every city. What we did have, though, is the week before, we had Proud Boys getting into fights with people. We had Enrique arrested. And now that's far more minor compared to BLM riots. I will still give you that. Now,
although that kind of struck. Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you. I was just going to mention the fact that Enrique, I assuming you're talking about the leader of Proud Boys. I can't remember them all by name.
Enrique Tarrio.
That shows that, again, another example of them not handling these crazy MAGA people with kid gloves necessarily, or letting them off scot-free at the very least. And again, I'm not trying to say that there may not be some measurable level of them being somewhat nicer to the MAGA people, or some, I'm not precluding that from possibility. I'm just pointing out that the difference doesn't appear to be anywhere near as extreme as is often implied strongly
I'll
by
take
these
that.
far
Yeah.
left demagogues on Twitter and on Facebook.
Yeah, I will agree with that. And I think, as much as I will agree that, the comparison wasn't entirely fair, this is not to excuse them, but where do you think they learned it from?
Where do I think who learned what from?
Where do you think these bad left memers learned this bad left memeing from?
I mean, to some degree, demagoguery comes pretty natural to almost every leader of a crazy movement throughout history.
Okay, fair. Yeah. But
I don't think the Trump people had to teach it to them, although the Trump people or Trump himself may have offered a very prominent example of how to demagogue in the modern times, particularly recent years, if that's what you're getting at.
Yeah, fair. Yeah, exactly. And to get back to your point about, okay, if there were a series of riots, I think you could actually take that point home, which is now that we've had just one at the Capitol building, we have thousands of National Guards sleeping inside.
Right.
Yeah. And so that kind of goes to show, if and when there is a hint of high possibility of a violent attack, yes, National Guard still does stand up, and that's a good thing. But
absolutely,
I think maybe the white privilege point was less about when is the police proper response of, I don't know how to say this without, because it's hard to say, the very first riot. I think probably the leftists will say this, which is, even at the very first riot, even if you didn't say, Lincoln Memorial, even during the first riot for George Floyd, the first riot, first protest, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Granted, unless you were fast enough to strike before the police were ready, I think that would be the only comparison. But as soon as a riot broke out, as soon as there was a sign of unrest, every peaceful protester, not rioter, make a difference. Mm-hmm. Every peaceful protester understands, don't get near the cops. They're dangerous. You're going to get shot, and when you get shot, nobody cares who's right or wrong.
Right.
That is a privilege that that white people don't have to worry about, or not as much, because when you see all these armed protests, whether peaceful or not, they never have to worry about confronting police if they wanted to. Granted, half the time they're bootlickers, so they don't confront the police. But
I mean, I don't know if that's necessarily true that they don't have to worry, because obviously, again, this current Capitol Hill riot proved that indeed white people rioting do get shot and gassed and tracked down by the FBI afterwards for prosecution. So it does happen. But I understand what you're trying to get at, in the sense that there is the possibility and even likelihood that to some degree white people do feel more confident that it's not going to happen.
Exactly. Yes, that's what I was getting at. Yeah. It is less about whether police are nice to them. It's more about they know that whether it's their crowd or their flag or their gun, they have an environment that gives them some confidence, whether justified or not, to demand things like, give me the election that I think I won, versus Black Lives Matter people demanding, please don't shoot us.
Right. I completely agree. I think that on average, there is a trend where cops feel more at ease and more comfortable around right-wingers and MAGA people and all these people with the
Blue Lives Matter, more afraid.
Or I mean the Blue Lives Matter flags, for obvious reasons. But I think that gets at my point that I've made online, that it seems more about tribe rather than skin color or race in those situations.
Absolutely.
Because if the police were let's just control for color. Let's say an entire crowd of black individuals, or two crowds. One of these crowds has a whole bunch of people with MAGA hats on and Trump 2020 banners, and the other one has, whatever stereotypical things you could think of from Antifa or BLM or something like that. The cops are still going to feel much more comfortable with the MAGA crowd. And you could do the same thought experiment with two white crowds. If there
Totally.
is two white crowds that look like one of them is a bunch of MAGA supporters and one of them is a bunch of Antifa or BLM or whatever what have you, they're going to feel significantly more comfortable with the with the MAGA people. And I think if you're like, let's think statistically as far as actual numbers, when we're talking about regression coefficients or a correlation, there would be a much stronger effect size for political tribe than there would for race.
I completely agree. And I do think if you were to just dissect the original claim and say that it was poorly worded and switch the words out and say, okay, this is maybe not white privilege versus lack of white privilege and colored people. Think of it as if this is the privilege between pro-Trump fascists and leftists. I think the privilege and benefit of doubt from police is much more clear and easier to argue. And yeah, I totally agree. Like, you can see if a black person were in that MAGA crowd, nobody would care as long as he's on their side, waving the same flags and fighting along their side. Now, if a white person was in the BLM crowd, again, he would be welcome as long as you don't wear a Camp Auschwitz t-shirt.
Yeah.
So that's the difference.
And with that, I'd even point out that from the sheer ethnic makeup of America, there were probably more white people in the BLM crowds than there were black people. By the simple fact that African Americans only make up something like 11% of the United States populace, whereas white people are, I think, around 67%.
It wouldn't surprise me. Yeah.
But anyway, or are you finished with what you were saying? Or
yeah.
Oh, okay. So that kind of, for me, led into the other topic of the utility of the word white privilege in the first place. Because again, I've kind of talked about this online, that I understand what the term white privilege is, and I agree with what people in theory are meaning by it, in the sense that on average, white people do not have a lot of the barriers that black people on average have to overcome. And so that is a privilege. But when discussing with people who use the term white privilege a lot, they rarely actually use it in a good faith attempt to get you to examine the ways in which you haven't had to overcome barriers and the ways in which African Americans have had to overcome barriers. They almost always use it to browbeat you into submission. They almost always use it as an ad hominem attack to basically say, you're evil, you're bad. I don't have to consider what you're saying because I'm able to just dismiss any validity to your argument simply by saying that you're suffering from white privilege. And so I think
I know what you're saying, and I think I've heard very similar arguments to that. So I'll let you finish, then I'll address it.
Oh, okay. Well, and so one of the things I'd point out is the writer David Frum, who is a never-Trumper from previously on the Republican Party, who wrote a book mentioning how basically saying that white people have fewer barriers to overcome than black people do is the functional equivalent of saying that white people have white privilege, right? Definitionally, they're basically saying the same thing.
If you ignore nuance and context, yes, that's what it would sound like, yes.
I don't think that's ignoring terribly large amounts of nuance or context, but in any way, let's just go with the general point is that white people don't have to overcome these barriers. Whenever you poll people and you ask them whether they are enjoying white privilege, there's a much lower positive response rate than there are from if you ask people if they think that white people on average don't have to overcome many of the barriers throughout life that black individuals do. And so when you frame it from an accusatory way rather than just a kind of explanatory or compassion-based perspective, a lot more people will agree. And many people that probably voted for Trump.
Yeah, but whether you agree doesn't make it true or untrue.
I'm not sure what your point would be. As I was saying,
my point is I don't care if I say it nicely or rudely. I don't care if you like it or not. What's true is true, isn't it?
Absolutely. But that's not what I'm arguing here.
Okay.
My point here is if you're actually trying to make progress and convince people to stop being racist and to acknowledge these problems, you don't approach the situation from an accusatory, hateful, tribal way. You approach it from trying to empathize and find collective goals.
Totally. Yeah, absolutely. And that's what I think, last time we talked, and that's what I think Floyd and Chauvin really got us this last year, which is for most of Trump's 3.5 years, people kind of dismissed Black Lives Matter as, well, what about black on black crime? Or what about white lives and all that bullshit?
Right. Those are all hardcore right-winger arguments.
But you got a lot of people in the middle fooled too. So, yeah. Exactly. Cause exactly. If you don't word it in a compassionate, considerate way and you sound like you're always accusing somebody, yeah, nobody's going to listen. I get that. Now, when Floyd was killed and people were at home on their Instagrams and Facebooks and Twitters, they see their friends feeding them bit by bit, telling them, please do nothing else. Just listen to me for a few minutes, read this slide and then this slide. I beg you, just try to listen. And if you still disagree, fine. I just want borrow your ear for a few minutes. That is when people slowly digested what systemic oppression means. People started to understand that people can be complete innocent players in a system that they don't understand is biased, and the result would still be biased because people were following just the rules that were maybe not even were intended as being biased or oppressed, but the system is in the end skewed towards people of privilege. And right. My point is, George Floyd's death really gave people the time to look at this again. And now more people have a better understanding of what systemic racism and privilege mean. And to get back to what you were saying earlier, you're right. I remember the first few months that I was telling people about privilege, people were, ganging up on me saying, why do you have to be so mean to me? And I just sit back and laugh. And I said, well, look at you. Look at how quickly you are at being offended. And he says, yeah, because I've been through this and this. I said, I didn't say you didn't. And so it came to, just yelling back and forth. And I realized, okay, I can't tell if this person just doesn't want to listen or I'm not giving him enough time to think about it. Is it really my problem or his? And
right.
After a long time and taking into account what you just said, I think back at another example, which is one of my friends. He's a white gay guy who loves Trump, or at least doesn't hate Trump.
Mm-hmm.
He would always point out the flaws or exceptions to identity politics, and he would always say, identity politics is so stupid because it's so stereotypical and whatever. And I didn't know how to disagree with him, but now I know how to actually present the argument so that either he can't disagree, or if he has to disagree, he has to be a little more specific. And that is, identity politics, just like white privilege, is poorly understood. When we say identity politics,
or poorly defined as well.
Yeah. When we say identity politics or intersectionalism, we are not saying if you're black, you must vote this way, or if you're black, you must vote for a black person, or if you're gay, you have to believe in this policy. What we're saying is, if you are somebody who lived through your experience being black or being gay, and if you have ever been a victim as a result of your identity, whether your own identification or external perception, shouldn't you have more experience than people who did not? And shouldn't that inform you to be more empathetic to people who've been in your shoes versus people who have not?
Right.
And if that is the case, should it not be a reasonable expectation for me to think that you should vote on the side of compassion? That's what we mean by identity politics. It's not because you're born one skin color or one gender, therefore you must vote one way. It's think of what you've been through and think of people who are in your shoes and not in your shoes been through. And if you had to randomly pick your fate tomorrow or put on a veil of ignorance, what would be the system that would be equitable to somebody in your shoes and somebody not in your shoes and somebody less better off than you? That's what we mean by identity politics and privilege for them.
Right. And so there's a lot of the principles like that, I agree and fully appreciate as far as when they're described or when in definition or in theory, whatever you have it like. With intersectionalism, it's hard or impossible to say that if African Americans on average suffer a certain more barriers than the average American, and if gay individuals on average suffer more barriers or have to overcome more barriers than the average individual, it makes sense that a gay African American would therefore compound that. And so that is absolutely a legitimate concern and something that's worthy of serious consideration. What happens is, particularly on social media, on the internet, there's a lot of people who identify as intersectional that much of their worldview and much of their actions split way off from what you would think that, or what would be the logical reaction to those principles. Basically, I'm referring to the people that are acting more based on tribe. They
Wait,
know
so
the doc.
Hold on. So they vote based on tribe, but they're still not fitting the mold, is what you're saying?
No, I'm not even referring necessarily to voting. I'm simply talking about principles that a lot of people have on the left, and again, just the bare principles that I would agree with. Mm-hmm. Many of those on the left take these principles and go to extreme lengths with them, or even half the time it's not even about principles, for the same reason that a lot of Trump voters will cite a talking point. The whole point of it is just to be a tribal comeback or a tribal own you statement. If that principle ever became inconvenient for argument, they'd flip-flop on it. So the principle doesn't really matter. And so while I think that is probably the largest portion of the Trump section, I also think that is the people who it's about tribe is also probably one of, if not the largest sections on the left as well.
Yeah, totally.
I mean, it's for example, it's like climate change. Most left-wingers and right-wingers don't know the nuances of climate change. They don't know what albedo is. They don't know what, they haven't compared the data from the UK Met Office. They haven't compared the data from the Japanese, I can't remember, Meteorological Society. They don't know any of the data. They just know what the tribe's official position is. And so they all just, the left and right chant a mantra. Now, the people on the left, by accident, are on the correct side. Global anthropogenic climate change is real and it deserves to be addressed. But it's not that the majority of the people fighting for that actually understand it much better than the left-wingers they're fighting against. And so to me, it's the same thing with almost every issue, whether it's intersectionalism, whether it's race, whether it's Trumpism, etc.
Yeah. And with regards to things like climate change, you're right that on average, controlled for the fact that leftists and just simply have more people, and people who accept climate change are the greater majority. So the sample size isn't the same. But even so, right. Yes, you're right. The average leftist or the average climate change accepting person doesn't understand it more than the people who deny it. But the people who accept it do not accept it because it's the leftist position as much as they accept it because it's a scientist position. That's the difference. To
some degree, but pretty quickly, there's multiple areas where you find that the left...
Oh, let me guess. You're going to say nuclear energy.
Oh, yeah. Well, nuclear energy. But sorry, I didn't mean to sound... correct your pronunciation or anything. That was a little pedantic, but it reminds me of George Bush when he says nuclear the wrong way.
Yeah. But yeah, what else?
GMOs. I would say anti-vax, but that's a large portion of both the left and the right.
Unfortunately, yeah.
But that also is still an example of a large portion of the left that rejects science, kind of going against the universal respect for science.
Okay, fair enough.
And so there are multiple examples.
Okay. Now to your now let me address the thing I read yesterday that you asked me to read about the ultra woke.
Mm-hmm.
I've said for a long time, and this was especially true in the first 1 or 2 years of Trump being elected. You didn't know me back then, but I remember saying to my friends that I honestly believe that much of the SJW movement, kind of like just like TERFs,
mm-hmm.
they're not real people, as in they're not people who actually believe it, people who are willing to put themselves on record. They're just online trolls. And they're very likely people from the opposite side trying to make you look bad and just to bait people into being angry.
Right.
And
I haven't actually run into hardly any TERFs. I've only heard about them.
okay.
For the same thing of incels, I haven't actually run into many, if any, incels. It's just, out there as people that supposedly exist that you've never really run into.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah. I can definitely give you, examples of TERFs if you want to see some, but yeah, incels I stay away from, but I definitely believe they exist. Now,
pretty much have to go to 4chan or all these really
yeah, totally, exactly,
strange or seedy places to actually run into them.
Yeah, but when you think about
sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
It's okay. These exceptional boogeymen, don't know if they exist. Oh yeah, what I was getting at was up until maybe 2018, I used to believe that, okay, these extremists, like these SJWs, they're not real people. Nobody actually believes that. They're just trying to discredit us.
Mm-hmm.
But maybe around 2018, I started to see, yeah, there literally is somebody in everything. Granted, they're very rare,
mm-hmm.
but there probably is somebody that believes anything and everything. But they're so few that they could be fake, they could be real, but they're so few. But people like to blow it up and find the worst examples and say, haha, this is what you believe.
Right, absolutely. Every right-winger in a meme attacking SJWs, they have the same purple-haired girl with glasses screaming in every single meme.
Every time, Greg or Kevin or Will post something like that, and I just say, and I'm supposed to care what this person thinks. Why? Because they're a party leader or they're my president or what? I mean, you find somebody in a dark corner of the internet to laugh at us. I got somebody who's in office speaking to international press television, talking like an idiot. I mean,
saying completely incoherent, hateful, stupid, demagogic things. So I kind of went along the same way. I initially thought that people were exaggerating the amount of quote unquote SJWs or the ultra far left, whatever you'd like to call these people, or even people that genuinely think communism or communism's not so bad, or that the Soviets weren't doing things too terribly. I thought that was basically non-existent outside of 4chan and areas like that too. Except over the last few years, I have literally run into multiple people that aren't just on the internet, that are people I interact with and people I have interacted with and people that go to my university. Despite my university being in a very conservative part of Texas, I'm still running into these people in noticeable numbers. And so I, after a while, came to realize that it's not a negligible amount of people who fit into this crazy quote unquote SJW category. Like there's actually a decent amount of them. And that's part of the reason why I criticize that movement more often than I did online. Of course, the people from that movement that run into my criticisms immediately assume I'm a right-winger, despite the fact that I am still on the left, and I attack Trump and I attack right-wingers still, on average, more than I do SJWs in the far left.
Yeah, totally.
Again, the word SJW has kind of fallen out of is common as it was a few years ago. Now it's woke. I don't really care what word anyone uses.
But woke is what they call themselves. SJW is what opponents call them.
Right. Well, of course, now the opponents also call them woke.
Yeah.
But anyway, my whole point is that say again, 5 years ago, 6 years ago even, let's say, I wasn't a huge fan of Sam Harris. I watched that
I was the opposite.
I watched that thing with him and Ben Affleck, and I was like, yeah, Ben Affleck, you go. And then the more I matured as a human being and learned about other things and challenged my worldviews and all that other sort of stuff, the more I'm like, I don't actually think what Ben Affleck was implying Sam Harris was meaning was what Sam Harris meant. And so in the same way that I used to be very much considered myself a Christian, I thought the Bible was perfect, and I, had little, if any, doubt. And if anyone questioned it, I would have responded pretty vigorously. Eventually I got to the point where I thought, if I am right, then examining my beliefs critically under good amounts of scrutiny should allow me to come out on the other end even stronger. Well, I did that, and I basically left religion. And so, kind of in a similar way, I thought that these SJWs and far leftists weren't really a thing, or they weren't really as extreme as people indicated, or all this other sort of stuff. And so I balked at people like Sam Harris, and I balked at anyone who warned me or tried to tell me that there was some, complaint about SJWs. And especially after probably within the last 2 years running into these people a lot more, I completely reversed my position. Like, they are not, like I said, a negligible part of the overall left movement. I'm on regular basis blown away by the fact that there's so many genuine Soviet and
Stalin apologists.
Yeah, and apologists for Mao Zedong, and just like, I'm like, are you kidding me? Like, they have entire Facebook groups. One of the people that I know in Amarillo and invited me to a Facebook group that turned out to be nothing but apologist stuff for the Soviets and for the Chinese Communist Party and all this. And in the membership of this group, I went down the list. I noticed like a dozen or so people from my university that I've met.
Wow. Are you familiar with Jason Unruhe?
Unruhe?
Or I think that's his last name. Yeah. Well, his channel is called Maoist Rebel News.
Maoist Rebel News?
Probably not.
No, I've never heard of him.
Yeah, he's probably the YouTube's one of the biggest YouTube tankies, and he wears a Maoist armband, and he's always talking about how great China is. I used to think, I was like, he's joking, right? But he's a very well-read guy. So, unfortunately, he's serious. And like Trumpers, people like him, their defense is basically, well, somebody's worse.
Yeah.
When you hear North Koreans defend their government, I'm talking about North Koreans outside of North Korea, obviously.
Right.
They'll always say, well, Americans, you're no better. How can you criticize us? Or China, you're no better. How can you criticize us? That's always their defense.
Yeah, it's been a common defense throughout history just for various things. I mean, I'm trying to think of the example, but it was one of those authoritarian countries that America criticizes, and they're like, well, I think it may have been Russia. I think there was criticism coming out because Russia's cracking down and treating the LGBT community like crap, and they were getting criticized about it by Americans, and Russia's like, well, look at how you're treating black people. And it's just interesting how I'm like, or how about we look at how both people are treating both groups? But yeah, so moving along,
okay.
Was there anything you particularly disagreed with in my argument in the article that I had given you?
No,
that we haven't already discussed?
No, I think you're generally right, which is, one, be wary of people who are dogmatic. Two, I think this is something that, despite, all my years changing back and forth, something I always appreciated about Michael Shermer is that he always reminded people, stick to principle. It's not about who is right. It's about sticking to the principle of being skeptical.
I love Michael Shermer, by the way.
Yeah. And I think and that's the funny thing, like Michael Shermer, as recent as like literally last year, still said the old cliche, conservative talking point that was so embarrassing that somebody believes it in 2020. But as soon as he was corrected, he he apologized and corrected himself. He said, well, Nazis had socialists in their name. That means they're socialists. And I thought,
Right.
dude, how could you be a professor and not know this? Like he knows enough about history. He studied, the Holocaust. He wrote a book about Holocaust deniers. How could he not know this?
Yeah.
And the reason he didn't know this, or he didn't believe it, or he was comfortable saying it, was because he is biased. He's, as much as he criticized Ayn Rand for being a cult, he was still a libertarian. Like, he admitted that, although he voted for John Kerry in 2004, he admitted that most of his scientists and skeptic friends are leftists, and he's the only, kind of pro-capitalist kind of person. So in this light, he's very more likely to suck up that argument that, well, since they're less libertarian than I am, then it's okay to call them, statists or socialists. If that's your only measure, sure, you got that point. But that's a whole different thing to say they're leftists or socialists. But point being, he corrected himself. And so John Stossel, I used to admire, because I used to think of him as somebody who really had no sacred cows. But I guess during Trump years, SJWs just made it so easy to make fun of him that all he had to do was say, SJWs are funny to make fun of. And it sounds like he's defending Trump.
Right. Yeah. Well, and some of that, because that sort of thing annoys me too, because at that point you're just stirring the pot. Like, if your statements about them aren't largely you literally criticizing them, if you're just getting your jollies off by attacking them, then that's completely different. Going back to Michael Shermer, another example of exactly what you were just talking about, him doing that, is he's written an article for his magazine, I think it's Skeptic Magazine or something like that, where he talks about how vigorously he didn't accept climate change for the longest time. And then after a certain point, he could not deny it, that he was confronted with the data, and he said, okay, I'm now quite convinced about it, and that's all there is to it. I can't say that it's not true anymore. And now he acknowledges and talks about, climate change the way any other person would. And so, yeah, I know what you're talking about with some of his stuff, because I follow him on Twitter, and I can't remember what it was, but a couple of times over the year, he'll say something. I'm like, that's kind of crazy. And it's amazing to hear so many good arguments and, reasonable things come from you, and then to hear you say something like that from time to time. But as long as you're not looking at his body of work, his entire thing in bad faith, as long as you're not cherry picking, as long as you're not looking to label him a god or label him a devil, you can look at his overall stuff and say, yeah, in general, he's still pretty reasonable. And some of the occasional crazy statements aren't worth completely dismissing him about. One of my first experiences with him was reading his book, The Moral Arc. And that is where I learned that huge amounts of the left and the right absolutely knee-jerk and reel back when you tell them that on average we're better off now than we were 10 years ago, and on average those people were better off than the people 10 years before that, and so on and so forth. And people on the left and right hate those facts.
Okay, well, see, I'm not sure that's true, and I hate to disagree, but seriously, I used to be one of those people. Like, before Trump, I used to be very, I was kind of, I'm not either party, because I used to be a libertarian. But before Trump, I remember being mad at both sides, because I remember hearing both sides being nostalgic. Like, Michael Moore would not stop telling us how easy life was when his, working class dad was able to give him vacations and buy a house and all that. And I remember really hating people say that. And I remember hearing liberals say that. And I at the time, I didn't know how to tell people you're actually, nostalgic. You're actually romanticizing the past, or you're thinking about the past that only people like you had, and people of color and women or gay people did not have. So, my point is that I think left-leaning people are in fact half and half on life was better in the past versus life was worse in the past. Because I think if you look at it from a white privilege standpoint, or people critical of white privilege, then you have to accept that, like, for minorities, it is more equal now. As
Right.
bad as it is now, it is still better than 40 or 50 or 100 years ago. White people, whether liberal or conservative, both have a reason to believe, because it's little pain on their back or shoulder. I don't forgot the terminology, to say life was kind of better. Because sure, whether you were poor or
Right.
rich,
They at least have they have somewhat of an argument that they could make.
Exactly. Yeah.
But again, that the argument would still have to be very specific and only about very specific things. And so I completely agree with that. I don't think we disagreed. Maybe I misworded.
Yeah, I agree. My only point to you was that I think leftists, because now we're more educated about white privilege and inequality in the past, will at least half of them will agree that life is better now.
Right. I would probably agree. We could always, argue about the exact percentage. I would point out, though, that I don't think that the, quote unquote, ultra woke would uniformly acknowledge it, whereas the other people don't. I think even half of their party still act like there's basically been no progress within civil rights and whatnot in the last 20 or 30 years.
Okay, so I think that's a very important question. And I think posing this question will actually quickly get you to see if the person you're talking to actually has a position or they're just trolling. So if you met a person and they said life is worse today, okay, not better. So they could mean worse or they could mean not changed. Find out what that is first. If they say worse, I really want to know what they're saying, which is when was that better time? When was America greater or better? I want to know. Whatever it is you believe, if you actually believe it, I want to know what it is you're pointing to.
Right.
So if you don't have an answer, I know you're trolling.
Right. And so there probably are trolls that way. I don't think the people that I have in mind are trolling. They basically, and the whole point or the whole observation that people eulogize the past and are very short-sighted is a very consistent cognitive thing, or it's a very consistent finding in cognitive psychology. And so because most of these woke people, actually most of them are fairly young, and so basically they're going on, well, look at all the black people shot in the last 5 years. This must mean that things are worse today than they have been in the past. And they don't zoom out of the picture to see how many more black people were shot in the past, particularly in the 60s and during civil rights. People are very short-sighted, and it seems to be a very common, no matter what political party you are, no matter what part of the spectrum you're at, it seems very, very consistent
yeah, I know what you're saying.
People love to eulogize the past. Whenever they remember the past, the painful memories are weak. Part of it's probably self-serving, because if they're in bad situation today, they want to blame it on something in the past or totally. Something like that.
And this this is amplified, and probably obviously not created, but this is amplified by our meme culture and our addiction to small sound bites. Like when somebody can give you two pictures and juxtapose them, and you don't think critically, okay, this is taken out of context, then of course you're going to very easily make comparisons that shouldn't be made.
Yeah. Oh yeah,
like
absolutely.
People love bringing up this fact, and I'm sure it's probably true if you look at the right place, that people today work more hours than medieval peasants. Yeah, so what?
I don't know if that would actually be an accurate statistic. But
even if it was true, so what?
Yeah.
I mean, this is why, if you don't have context, it doesn't really matter. This reminds me of when a multi-level marketer tried to sell me on something. He says, "You have to work for your time. I make money while I sleep." And I said, "What do you trade for your time?" That's kind of a rhetorical question. But what I really was trying to say was, okay, you may make money while you sleep. You may sleep 8 hours and make a cent or $1 or maybe $100. But because I trade 8 hours for my time, I have $500. So are you really going to say you have more money than me? No. But if you don't have context, you don't have action, you could be fooled by anything.
Right. Absolutely. Well, and back in my more tribal political days, like 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 years ago, following the other 98%, following being liberal, following the daily costs, following all the standards for the left, they paint such a simplistic. Oh, can you hear me now? Can you hear me? Are you there?
Every word. Damn it.
I can hear you a little bit, but I can hear you to some degree.
Okay. Let me keep talking. I'll tell you what I didn't hear.
Oh, okay. Anyway, basically, I was just saying that I agree about the meme situation, especially for people that are highly tribal and particularly for people that are low information that don't realize they're low information, which is actually probably the majority of both the left and the right. They think that these memes they're seeing, as you know, from the perspective of the left person, from the other 98% from being liberal, they think, yeah, that's right. That's all. And whatever nuance there might be isn't important enough for me to actually know. And so I'm justified in just going by this little soundbite thing. And again, they're doing the exact same thing to an equal level on the right. And this meme culture is just exacerbating this natural or seemingly natural tendency to oversimplify everything. Getting back to, again, whether or not now is better than any time before, it's not even just Michael Shermer who made the argument. It's Steven Pinker, an extremely well-respected cognitive psychologist, extremely well-respected. He wrote the book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, which I haven't had a chance to read the whole thing. I've read part of it, but it's one of the thousands of books on my stack that I'm trying to get through. He makes the same argument. And so for the people that want to pretend like now is always the worst time, this is very common as far as right-wingers go in the people who think that now is the end times. It's always the end times to them. The world is so fallen.
Well, but you have to understand. But you have to understand, right-wingers do have good reason to believe that now is worse. Because if you're a person of privilege and people are becoming more equal, why wouldn't you feel like it's getting worse for you?
They don't have a good. They have cherry-picked instances where that might slightly be the case, but in most of the instances, it's not a matter of their part of the pie getting smaller. It's a matter of the entire pie having got bigger, and theirs just not having increased as much as everyone else's. They're still, in most categories, better off than they were 30 years ago.
I'm trying to think. So,
I mean, think of the average poor white person 30 or 40 years ago. How hard were they better off then, or is the poorest white person better off now?
Yes, but the person you're talking to isn't an average poor white person. He's an average not poor white person. Then shouldn't he be angry that it's less likely that he could be a rich white person than it was, 20 or 30 years ago?
I don't necessarily. It depends maybe. Maybe. It depends how you define rich person. It depends how you define better off. For example.
Okay, let me use this example. Using Michael Moore's story, when I was a non-poor white person growing up, my dad could work a blue-collar job, support a family, and we could have regular vacations. Today, I can't do that. So, do I not have a good reason to believe that capitalism is fucking me over?
Right. So, and people on the left would. Well, I mean, he is on the left. So, the example, of course, is that education and healthcare and a few other things have gone well above inflation. And so it is those things are extremely expensive. And while that's a legitimate concern, and while that's absolutely something to think about, you're up until literally 2 years ago, life expectancy still was pretty much on a constant, let's focus on the healthcare thing. Healthcare is ultra expensive, all that sort of stuff. And yet up until the last 2 years, life expectancy has still increased, despite the fact that 95%, in other words, 95% of the time, that's an arbitrary number, maybe 97, I don't know. Most of the time that healthcare has become more expensive, we've still increased our life expectancy. And this is also happening concurrently with our eating habits not getting any better.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're still getting the medical care better than we did 30 years ago. again, that's not to say that we don't need to overhaul the system. We absolutely do. I'm in favor of universal health care. Everybody knows that. Everyone knows that I think we should make significant improvements in health.
Okay, so I think you answered my question, even if you didn't intend to answer it this way. And I think this is very important, which is when you're looking at things through the lens or blinders of white privilege, the things you're complaining about are always monetary, or I don't want to say minor or superficial, but they're always smaller things than being shot. They're smaller things than being systematically denied a house. So from using Michael Moore's or the example of somebody who can't buy a house on a blue collar job, what really is happening is what he's saying is, I can't afford it. But if you ask everything else, yes, I'm better off. I'm just complaining that the house I wanted isn't as cheap as it used to be. And that's my problem.
Right. Completely agree. So what you're saying is Michael Moore is exhibiting or is showing his white privilege, so to speak.
Yeah, totally. And I think now that I see exactly what you're saying, which is when people complain about the things that they have good reason to complain about, they really are zeroing in on the few things that they want to complain about, ignoring the dozens of things that they're way better off on. I totally agree now.
Right. Absolutely. I'm glad you synthesized what I was trying to say that way. Sometimes I go off on a rant or a tangent, and I even am not organizing my point in the most understandable way.
Yeah. And of course, you know this. I think everybody who hears this can understand. What if that's the only things I care about? What if that's just my life's mission? Like if you were a person working in a religious institution, the only thing you care about is being saved. So yeah, if that's the only thing that's being disrupted, of course you're going to think your whole world's being messed up. Nobody cares if you eat better or live longer or have happier children or live in a bigger house. If all you care about is being saved, then yeah, that's the only thing you're going to complain about. Right.
Which ironically, a lot of the Christians, the white Christians, white conservative Christians specifically, are complaining that they probably think their religious freedoms are being impinged on now than they were 50 years ago, when that's absolutely not the case. They're simply not being allowed to impinge on other people's freedoms using that religion. They still have every bit as much religious freedom as they had 50 years ago.
Yeah. And they're not thinking about, this is again, it varies by country, but yeah, today you can fly or virtually contact anywhere people allow you to fly and people who have internet, and you can preach those countries, and you couldn't do that 50 or 100 years ago because of economics. But, at the same time, I'm sure there are countries today, whether in the Middle East or Asia, that are more hostile to preachers or people. So it varies by country.
Right.
You can cherry pick whatever you want.
That example of, I can't remember if it was Sri Lanka or some island off the coast of India. People aren't supposed to go there. Basically, there's a ban on outsiders going there because they're afraid of the tribe's culture being wiped out or something to that effect. Some evangelist missionary, Christian missionary, went there regardless.
Oh yeah, I know what you're talking about.
And he got killed. Not saying that I think that I'm happy he got killed. I'm not happy anyone gets killed, but just a little tidbit on the topic that you were talking about. Yeah, and so in other words, no matter what way you look at it, you have to be really cherry picking things, and you have to be looking at things really zoomed in and narrow mindedly in order to think that things are worse now than they were 10 years ago, and so on for the 10 years before that and before that and before that. And so this is just looking at I would say just looking at America, this trend is strong and holds true. But if you zoom all the way out and you're looking at the world, if you're looking at the world violent crime rate, if you're looking at the world rape rate, murder rate, poverty rate, access to healthcare, access to clean water, women's rights, it is an even starker improvement than it was, 50 years ago. We have made a huge amounts of progress overall in the world, much of this progress being made in Africa. Yeah. Of course, there's places where they've hit road bumps, like in Uganda, again, where missionaries have gone there and taught them to hate gay people extra, and so now gays are getting murdered and whatnot there. But
are you familiar with Gravel Institute?
The Gravel Institute? No.
Oh, okay.
Not off the top of my head, anyway. Not off the top of my head.
Okay, yeah, he's a presidential candidate Democrat, and long story short, he made a YouTube channel to counter PragerU. And one of the videos they had was...
What's the name of this channel?
A Gravel Institute. I think it's spelled just like gravel.
Oh, okay. That's why I didn't know what you were talking about. Yeah, I have heard of the I thought it was pronounced gravel. It's probably gravel, but yeah,
maybe I'm wrong.
I haven't seen a lot about it. I saw maybe one tweet a week ago mentioning that, or someone's basically, the tweet said that the Gravel or Gravel Institute is just as bad as the PragerU, or just as bad as PragerU in the opposite direction. I haven't looked into it to verify. I haven't watched any of the Gravel Institute's videos, but sorry, I didn't mean. Go ahead.
Okay, yeah, I would love, when you have a chance, watch some and see if they're, more fair. But one thing I took away last week was, I think it was Richard Wolff. He made a video and he says, when people say capitalism has lifted people out of poverty, there's two things wrong with that argument. One is that they measure extreme poverty by an arbitrary number, something like $2 a day, as opposed to $8 a day, which is probably what you actually need to survive. He says that's a poor number to begin with. Fine. But secondly, if you count the number of people that supposedly was lifted out of poverty through capitalism or technology, most of it actually came from China.
Right. You mean in the last 30, 40, 50 years, China's loosening up of the command economy approach. They've drifted slightly more towards a market economy, and it's improved their standard of living based on that.
I don't know if that's the argument. I don't know if that's the exact cause, but I think Wolff's argument was that most of it happened in China, and that's a mix of both government action and capitalism and technology, and so you can't just say it's capitalism when
right, absolutely.
It's happening in
right. Well, Unbiased America's made the same, or what's the other one? Being Classical Liberal, they used to make comments like that all the time, basically worshiping the god of capitalism as the single most important innovation in history of mankind, like completely deifying it. And so I am personally the blatant, like completely hate capitalism approach that a lot of the far left takes, I think is stupid. I think it's throwing the baby out with the bathwater. But at the same time, deifying capitalism is equally stupid. Again, I like Andrew Yang's approach the best that I've heard of. I like his human-centered capitalism, making capitalism work for us rather than just letting it run loose and allowing unnecessarily problems to continue or to arise. I mean, you like Andrew Yang too, right? I think.
Yeah.
So how do you feel about his human-centered capitalism approach?
I think it's easier to sell than my criticism of capitalism. I'm much more hostile towards capitalism. I'm more willing to tax wealth. I'm more willing to tax vacant homes. I'm more willing to, I'm more inclined to say stop protecting property that's hoarded. But I understand that's not going to sell to most people. I'm okay with incrementalism, and I think he's more big leap than most incrementalists. So I think he's a step in the right direction. Now, I'm willing to admit that universal basic income is not, how do I say it? It's basically a bandage / life support. It is really admitting that capitalism is on its last stage or last leg, that capitalism can't keep accelerating the way it does because it's not sustainable. So yes, if we're going to have any capitalism at all, better be human-centered than not human-centered.
Right. And so there's a couple of things I would say is that as far as taxing the wealthy, I don't think that Andrew Yang is philosophically any more against taxing the wealthy than you are. His point is that when looking at the attempts that have been made in the past and in other countries to tax the wealthy, it's like a losing game. Every time you plug a hole in the bottom of the ship, another one springs. And so his argument is that practicality, adding a VAT tax and adding a universal basic income is the more practicable approach, at least with society as evolved or unevolved as it currently is, so to speak. And then as far as
I think he's right for America. Yeah, I think for Americans, the consumer culture that we have, yes, a consumer tax or a purchasing tax would be a more viable and easier to implement option than other forms, unfortunately. But ultimately, to make bigger leaps, we will have to do a bit more, like taxing accumulated wealth and taxing empty houses and taxing offshore assets or things like that.
Right. And I don't know if Andrew Yang's actually voiced opinions of whether he opposes taxing vacancy or not. I don't know what his
I don't think he's spoken on that, but I think he has.
I'm pretty studied on my Andrew Yang, so
yeah. But I do think he has specifically opposed wealth tax, though.
Right. Again, like I said, not in philosophy, but in practicality.
I understand.
And it's not even just the United States. He's alluded to the quote unquote socialist, but not really socialist countries like Denmark and Sweden and Norway, how they've attempted to tax wealth, and it didn't work the way they wanted to, and a VAT tax turned out to work better. But I wanted to mention I don't think UBI is a band-aid at all. I don't think it is a sign that capitalism is a failure. I think that UBI is actually like, for example, I think that raising minimum wage is a band-aid that is going to have to be reapplied and changed every few years. I think that UBI is a much, much more broad, efficient, and encompassing solution than that. And I think it's only basically the interpretation that it is signing it's the death knell of capitalism is only if you're considering anarcho-capitalism. I don't think that, and again, this gets into what you define as capitalism. I generally take a more broad definition, including market economy, free as possible, existence of a stock market and investment options without top-down absolute authoritarian control. And so there's tons of ways that you can implement that in publicly beneficial ways that recognizing that anarcho-capitalism is garbage doesn't mean that capitalism in general is garbage. It just means that you can't take a one-dimensional approach.
Okay. Yeah, I agree. And
so, again, a lot of this has to do with addressing things with people as they are. It'd be wonderful if, we could we could be like Star Trek, a moneyless society where everyone just works because work is fulfilling and everyone does the right thing. And not necessarily that everyone does the right thing, but they do it in a high enough proportion that society doesn't fall apart without money and all these other incentives. I would love that. But I'm focused on addressing things of how we can improve things with people as they are now, which is one of the reasons that I think that attempts at communism and all these things have failed so miserably, because they attempt to forcefully impose a system on people that their collective psychologies and sociologies are not compatible with or ready for. And so basically the incrementalist approach is still trying to get there, but in a way that's not going to be outright rejected and cause a backsliding in the other direction.
Totally, yeah.
Or risk of backsliding in the other. But I digress. Anything else that you wanted to get off your chest?
No. Just keep daring your Republican friends to dump their stocks.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I've run into the same thing where they keep predicting. It's been happening repeatedly over the last month. It's kind of like doomsday cults. They predict something's going to happen by this date, and after nothing happens, it doesn't faze them. They just predict a new date, and rather than lose confidence that they're good at predicting, they gained more confidence. What's her name, Powell, when she talked about the Kraken, I saw so many people on right-wing social media saying, yeah, you just wait until when Sidney Powell unleashes the Kraken, things are going down, and then nothing happens. She's a discredited moron that actually never had much credit in the first place. Then they moved it multiple times, and then it was you just wait until January 6th. Trump's going to refuse to certify the electoral college, and even the electoral college people are going to refuse to, it's just always something, always a prediction, and it's failed every time. And half the time I'm commenting to them the same thing that basically you just said. I'm like, hey, do you know of any good online betting arbiter who will take both of our money and dole it out to the winner? Because I am happy to take your money because you're gonna lose. Well, Kyle, it was great having you on, and it was an enlightening conversation as usual, and I appreciate it and look forward to the next time.
See you next time.